I am Patrick Yoes, National President of Fraternal Order Police. This is the Blue View. Well, Undersecretary, thank you for joining us today and be part of the Blue View podcast. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, sir. And let's go with Ken.
Okay.
Ken is fine. So thanks very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be speaking to your membership. So little introductory sort of bio. Ken Wainstein, now the Undersecretary for Intelligence Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security. So I have the honor of leading 1,000 or so people in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, which is INA. And that is the part of DHS that is within the intelligence community. It's an intelligence agency. It was stood up with the department back in 2003. It's now just a little over 20 years old. It's gone through a couple iterations, but it's relatively new, bureaucratically speaking, and it is the part of the department that is the bridge, the intelligence and information bridge between the intelligence community, all the IC agencies, DHS and its components, federal law enforcement, and all the state, local, territorial, tribal, and private sector partners that we have all around the country. And it was stood up as a recognition that that bridge, that information bridge, didn't exist, at least it wasn't robust enough before 9/11, and that's one of the reasons why 9/11 happened. So that's our mission. In terms of my background, I was confirmed by the Senate for this position in June last year, but this is my second stint in government. I've started out right out of law school. I clerked for a year for a judge, and then I became a federal prosecutor in Manhattan and was in the Justice Department for 19 years after that. Federal prosecutor in New York, down to D.C., ended up serving as the United States Attorney in D.C. I was the General Counsel and then the Chief of Staff of the FBI. I ended up serving as the first Assistant Attorney General for National Security when the National Security Division was stood up in DOJ in 2006, once again in a response to some recommendations that grew out of the study of 9/11 and the need for more integration between law enforcement and the intelligence community. And then from there, I went to the White House. I was the Homeland Security Advisor for President Bush for the last year or so of his administration. And then I went out to private practice as a lawyer, and I did that for the last 13 years, and then was blessed with the opportunity to come back into government and came back in last year.
Well, great. A whole Department of Homeland Security, when it sort of developed out of 9/11, really came a lot of factors, but one of them had to do with the lack of communication between the different, local, state, and federal partners. All had pieces of a puzzle, and it never really fit together. You talk a little bit about the importance of that network, of having that share of information on all of these levels to make a much more efficient effort to protect our country.
Yeah, great point, great question. Look, I can answer that as in a personal sense and also then sort of from an institutional perspective. Look, it was clear to me early on as a prosecutor, especially when I was prosecuting in Washington, D.C., that the best way to get after an issue, whether it's a local law enforcement issue, whether it's a national security issue, whether it's, an issue of human trafficking, drugs, what have you, is to get the parties who have involvement in that issue and make sure that they're integrated. So, for instance, I did a lot of work with the FBI Safe Streets here in D.C., and they've got a long and storied history of doing really good work. And that great work was all the result of the fusion and the coordination and, frankly, the camaraderie of Metropolitan Police Department, the FBI, and all the other federal agencies that were involved. And that integration did amazing things. And I saw that this is back in the 90s, well before 9/11. So 9/11 came along, and then all the sort of look-backs at 9/11 that sort of came to the conclusion that there was insufficient coordination, insufficient communication, wasn't surprising to me, right? And it's easier said than done, right? And it's tough to do that kind of coordination on a national scale. But look, I think much of the effort post 9/11 from, then President Bush down through the directors of the CIA and FBI and local law enforcement was to do that integration in the terrorism space. And then DHS, I think, was a recognition that it needed to be done in a more robust national level, and that DHS is was intended to be, as the secretary often says, it's a department of partnerships. That's what it's all about. It's about partnerships, and that's the reason it exists in many ways. And that's even more the case with INA, because our whole purpose is to make sure that we're enabling you, not just enabling the intelligence community, but enabling you first and foremost to get the intelligence you need to make decisions out in the field. How many people should be deployed to this threat, to that issue, to this region? And you're only going to know that whether you're a police chief, whether you're a mayor, whether you're a governor. You're only going to know that if you can anticipate where the threat is going to evolve, and that's our job, to get that information to you. And that information doesn't only come from DHS. It's information that's generated around the country. So we have the Homeland Security Intelligence Network, which is the mechanism by which we put out intelligence products from all our partners. And it's, we still have work to do in a variety of different areas, whether it's making sure that critical information gets on the HISN, the Homeland Security Intelligence Network, making sure that a sufficient number of state and locals have security clearances and the like. But I think we've come a long way in 20 years.
Yeah, no doubt. I can see the evolution of it as well. Homeland Security it's how many agencies did actually pulled in? It created this really
22,
large.
I think.
Yeah, it's 22 different cultures. Now moved into one, trying to develop its own culture. So certainly, as a challenge in itself alone, and in that sharing of information, even within. I could see that huge evolution. But I want to go back to most of our members are those local guys that are pushing squad cars. They run across some information, they get that information, try and move it up the chain, move information back. Can we talk just a little bit about just the fusion part of it, about how that information is flowing, how it works, and if there are any things on the end user's standpoint that they might be able to do that would make the flow of information better. Right.
So that's been a focus of ours, which is to get to that end user, get to that man or woman out in a squad car. And for instance, both in terms of getting information to them, we, for example, last year rolled out our app, the HISN app, HISN Intel app. So you don't have to be tethered to your desktop to scroll through Intel. You could actually be out in a squad car and look at it on your app. So that's helpful. But also in terms of getting the information and getting it into the intelligence bloodstream of the whole country, right? So it doesn't just reside with one police officer or one squad or one
gatekeeper who doesn't necessarily recognize the significance of.
Right, which and that's and also just is using that information for the immediate purpose of, let's say, prosecuting a case. I was a prosecutor. And I didn't think enough about, I got this information. How could this be used by some other jurisdiction or by some other program altogether? I didn't think enough about that. Yeah. And now in retrospect, I realize I should have, but that was, I had a pre-9/11 mindset. Anyway, so the focus is on enabling that person to get that information that they receive that relates to homeland threats in one way or another into that bloodstream. And so that's why we now have a person in each of the fusion centers. There are 80 fusion centers around the country, as you know, and we now have a DHS person, an INA person in each of those fusion centers, because we find that's the node, right? That's the place where you're sitting there as an INA person right next to somebody, a detective, a police officer from the local police department, and that's the person who has a relationship with the person in the squad car who's seeing something, maybe some suspicious activity or observations relating to human trafficking. That information gets in. It then can get, there can be a report. It can then be teamed up with information about similar patterns in other jurisdictions, and boom, you now have the makings of an investigation. So that's what we're really trying to encourage, both in terms of sensitizing people to the importance of intelligence, so that they're not acting like Ken Wainstein did in 1996 and just using information only for my own purpose, but also giving them the means to share that. And I can tell you, in my travels around the country and the different fusion centers I've visited, it's really amazing how people have recognized that. And it's not us, it's the police departments have recognized how important that is, and have actually put that in place, both in terms of procedures and, frankly, in terms of sort of culture.
Yeah.
And it's impressive.
What a change.
It is. And I think I told you, I stepped out 13 years ago, stepped back in last year, and it was interesting to be out that long and then to step back in and go, wow, things aren't perfect, but they're a lot better.
Oh, no doubt. I could see it in my, I'm 36 years in law enforcement. I could see that evolution, sharing information. I think, the mindset initially is who needs to know what. And you had a gatekeeper who said, well, this is significant. There's not. This is something I'm going to push down. We definitely have modernized the system and put it in, the reality is, especially protecting the homeland, the majority of the people, those guys that are working streets every day, the men and women that work the street every day are likely to run into pieces of this puzzle on a much more frequent basis than anything. And if we don't find a more efficient way to put that puzzle together, we'll never stay ahead of the challenges that we have. This is a tough time right now, especially in intelligence. Don't need to tell you, but we've got a lot of conflicts going on. You've got the whole Israel-Hamas issues, and so I know that has to be taxing your Homeland Security to a great extent. Do you care to share a little bit with that of kind of where we are and any concerns that we should our members should be familiar with?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's, in my years, I always sort of think, boy, this is a tough period. And then I get to the next period and go, yeah, that wasn't that tough.
It's progressive. There's no question.
It always seems that way. Yeah. But I do think this is a tough period. And it's tough for DHS because, we're right in the thick of so many of these, taxing and really challenging issues. And those issues relate to, obviously, immigration is a big issue the department is dealing with. The ripple effects or after effects of October 7th is a huge issue that we at INA are very focused on. And look, I just take a minute to talk about that. The terrorism threat has sort of waxed and waned over the years since, let's start at 9/11. Obviously, terrorism predated 9/11, but starting at 9/11, largely focused, we were focused on foreign terrorist organizations, specifically Al Qaeda and then ISIS, and then of course, over the last few years, you've heard Chris Wray and others say actually now the most lethal sustained terrorism threat that we face is domestic terrorism. So you had the sort of domestic terrorism in its various forms and shapes stepping to the fore over the last few years, and then you had October 7th. And October 7th, I think, has sort of sharpened the threat vectors against us in a number of ways, in ways I didn't anticipate, because you have a number of different actors who are now either re-energized to launch terrorist attacks or, potentially can be re-energized. So you've got the traditional foreign terrorist organizations, the Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others, and Hamas. Hamas hasn't traditionally targeted the homeland, but they're obviously a concern. They're animated about what's going on over there, even though, let's say, ISIS and Hamas are not best friends traditionally. You've seen ISIS putting out statements along with Al-Qaeda, calling for attacks against Israeli facilities and people, U.S. facilities and people, and Jews around the world. You obviously have Hezbollah being active in the north of Israel and sort of launching attacks, but then sort of only going so far for now. Obviously, the Houthis are getting into the game with their activities around the Red Sea, and of course, Iran is the sort of shadow behind them, and it's unclear where Iran is going to go. But obviously, Iran has a tradition of lethal plotting here in the United States that is public and we know about. And so it's possible that they could get more active in that respect. And then to add to those sort of more traditional nation-state actors and foreign terrorist organizations, you have the ripple effects of October 7th here on the part of domestic terrorists. So, you saw within hours of those horrendous attacks on October 7th, you saw some of the videos that were taken by the Hamas attackers being sort of reposted over here by, Nazi types and the likes, like sort of with saying things to encourage such attacks here in the United States against Jews. And we've seen, obviously hate speech, hate rhetoric, hate-fueled attacks against ethnic groups, whether Jewish groups, Muslim groups. We had a little 6-year-old Muslim boy was killed in the days after October 7th. And so the ripple effects of October 7th have been sobering, because it makes you realize it doesn't take much to sort of take the restraints off of some people who have the animosity to launch, terrorist attacks and to engage in hateful rhetoric. And no matter what happens with Gaza, whether things settle down in terms of military action over there or not, I think those after effects are going to be with us for a while.
Yeah. It's so I've had a lot of discussions. There's quite a few podcasts we've done talking about the challenges we have. I think a problem that, at least in a criminal element, and certainly that applies, broadly to, to a lot of the terrorist activity we talk about, is the change in technology, and the way that that communications take place now, the way that money's transferred now. The problem we've always had, and we will always have in law enforcement, is technology and trends outpace laws. We don't move fast enough to be able to address these changes with it. I know we've got a Section 702. There's some authorization coming that would impact our ability to be able to do some of the intelligence we do. You care talking a little bit about that, about what does the world look like if we do lose this? How does it hamper our ability to be able to keep our homeland safe?
No, I really appreciate you asking me that, because this is something I feel very passionate about. And just to sort of back up, frame it a little bit, Section 702 refers to an amendment to the original FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, that was passed at the end of the 1970s. And it was a process that Congress designed to require court approval for electronic surveillance wiretaps here in the United States for national security purposes generally. And it was enacted in 1978, and then technology, as you said,
it's always
greatly changed, because you didn't have fiber optic cables, all over the world like you did by the time 9/11 came along, and then encryption and the like. So after 9/11, it became clear we needed to do more electronic surveillance, especially against foreign terrorists. And there was a real push to reform or amend the original FISA to bring it up to date. And that resulted, and I was essentially involved in that from the Justice Department when I was heading up the National Security Division, dealing with really members up on the Hill who were engaged in a very conscientious effort to do the right thing, to make sure we had the tools we need, or the tool we needed, but also the civil liberties protections and the privacy protections that were necessary. And the result was the FISA Amendments Act of 2008, and it has Section 702, which essentially says that, if we, the intelligence community, are targeting for electronic surveillance a non-U.S. person who is believed to be outside the United States, then you don't have to go to court and submit a 50-page packet, et cetera, like you would for somebody in the United States. And that was passed. It has then been reauthorized a couple times since, and now it's up for reauthorization. It was kicked down the road for a couple more months, and Congress is wrestling with it. And the long and the short of it is, it would be really debilitating if we did not have that. I mean, one interesting fact is that I think something close to 60% of the intelligence in the president's daily brief, in other words, the briefing that the U.S. president gets every day, derives from information about that we obtained through 702, through that program. And if we didn't have that ability to both acquire that information and then use it nimbly, use it, at a speed that you need to run down threats, we'd be in a world of hurt, both in terms of terrorists, in terms of Chinese technology theft, in terms of fentanyl. Fentanyl is a huge issue. 702 is incredibly important against the foreign cartels that are shipping fentanyl into here. So it's really important that reauthorization go through.
Yeah, I think we all agree. We all agree that we, as Americans, we all have certain rights to privacy. at what point does that right to privacy outweigh the general interest, the greater interest of America? And I have no problem with the fact that they wrestle with that, because I think they should. But at the end of the day, I think most Americans will agree, if not, the vast majority, that certainly our safety and security should outweigh all of these issues. And I guess the question becomes whether we want to play offense or defense. Defense, we're always going to be reacting to something else. Offense means we're going to jump ahead of it before it actually happens. I'd much rather, and I think what most Americans agree, that we need to be much more aggressive in stopping events from happening rather than in trying to pick up the pieces at the end of it. So,
yeah, and I totally agree with you. And bottom line is, it's not a zero-sum game. You can have strong authorities and investigating tools, and also the necessary privacy protections to make sure they're not misused, right? And you can have oversight. And so I think it's healthy that Congress goes through a process like this and really takes a hard look at it, and then packages it in reasonable oversight and safeguards in the legislation. And in fact, that happened to us last year. Just last year, we had there was an effort to scale back our collection authorities, and it was heavily debated up in Capitol Hill, and then ultimately, after a lot of back and forth, Congress ended up providing some new protections and packaging our authorities with those protections, but allowed us to retain the critical authority that we needed to protect the American people. That actually was a healthy process, and it was a good result. And you played a critical role in that. You and IACP signed a letter that supported us in that, and I'm very grateful for that. That was obviously something that was well listened to and well noticed up on Capitol Hill, so thank you for that.
Yeah, it's I find some comfort in knowing that there are things that you probably know that keep you up at night. And I find a lot of comfort in knowing that there are people in Congress that are trying to determine how much access you should have to this information, and it keeps them up at night. So hopefully at the end of the day, we can find ourselves in a position where we can address these issues. And I think that's why it's so vitally important for intelligence in this partnership we have. So we're very, very proud to be part of that. So, I got my members are sitting in that squad car. They're working in agencies all across this country. What message do you have to them of being part? I mean, I'm sure from their standpoint, they, when it comes to protection in the homeland, I mean, it's probably viewed more towards how they're taking care of their community, but really they are a much bigger part to that. So, from your standpoint, the person who oversees all of this, can you give some words of encouragement to the grunts, the ones that are out there, day in and day out, doing the work and protecting their communities, and how they can play a big role into a bigger picture in the protection of our nation.
Well, let me answer it a couple of ways. First, let me say this: the thing I'm most proud of in this position, or at least having this position, I think this applies to any leadership position I had in government, was that I was on the team with those people. That I was on the team with the people on the line, and frankly, in the case of your membership, on the front line. And that's the best part of it. I mean, that's one reason I like this job, this particular government job, because it's very much the fusion of the federal law enforcement intelligence, but also state and local. And you work together. And that's what I always loved about when I was U.S. Attorney in D.C. D.C. is unique because it's, we're a federal district, so the U.S. Attorney prosecutes both the local and the federal crimes. So I work, Chuck Ramsey and I were working very closely together, and I loved that aspect of it. And so that was one of the best things about coming back into this job. And I'll tell you that, DHS, we play a role. Obviously, each of your agencies provides leadership in this space. But I can tell you that the Secretary Mayorkas, he has a background like mine, longtime federal prosecutor, and then U.S. Attorney. And then obviously 8 years in the DHS under President Obama, and then he's been there since the beginning of this term. You notice that he makes it a clear focus to always focus on the workforce, in law enforcement in particular. His first words are always about what the people on the line are doing. And if you ever watch him, whenever there's a criticism, and as you might have noticed, occasionally DHS gets criticized, his first
I
response,
noticed.
yeah, but his first response is always to defend the workforce. He doesn't worry about himself. That's leadership, and that's an important message, and it's one that I take to heart because I think those of us, and I count you in this group, obviously, even more directly, to the extent we have responsibility, direct or indirect, for the people on the line, it's an honor for us to have that role. And so our job should be to support them, first and foremost. That's our first obligation.
You know, you mentioned fentanyl. Mentioned to some extent the border. Talk a little bit just on an intelligence standpoint. I know there's a lot of information floating around out there from media sources and all. Fentanyl's becoming, no doubt, a crisis that makes, and the fact that we have not taken a stronger approach to this is kind of concerning, in the fact that it's flowing in at a rate that seems to be, defies logic. That we're allowing this poison to come into this country, and it's coming in at such a high level. And I know we through task force we do a great job. We've taken a lot of this poison off of the streets. But at the end of the day, we still have a national crisis here. Although we're having a huge impact in our enforcement portion of this and in seizures, it's not impacting the number of people that are affected by it. Any thoughts on kind of where we are with that, where we're going, and how do we jump ahead of this? I just recently testified before Congress on this very issue, and it all falls on that complexity of the way that transactions are done, the way that all of this is being done now is outpacing our ability to be able to stay ahead of it. Any thoughts that you could share with that?
Yeah, I do. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'll go back and read your testimony. So maybe you can fill in the blanks that I leave. Look, fentanyl it was interesting. When I first got here, I got briefed on fentanyl, and had, as relatively well-informed member of the public, I read the newspaper, etc. I had no idea how lethal this stuff was. That whatever it was, don't quote me, but like 3 grains of fentanyl in a pill is enough to kill you. Yeah. And I got briefed on that, and the first thing I did is call each of my daughters and said, don't take anything that you don't actually get in a prescription, in a bottle, sealed. Don't take it, because so often it's kids who just borrow a pill for stay awake at night and study or whatever it is, and then they end up dying. So anyway, it was really eye-opening, and you're right. Look, I think it's one of these things that we saw this increasing rate of death from fentanyl, and then got to the point where he had upwards of 100,000, 100,000 in 1 year. Yeah. And so a lot is being done. We in the department have had these special projects to flow people down to the border, and most of this is coming across in the ports of entry, and really focus on finding the drugs when they come across. And it's, the challenge is it's relatively easy to manufacture. It doesn't leave a signature. It's hard. It's not like meth or something where it's often easier to detect it. Small amounts, a small bag easily secreted in a car can get you a lot of money on the streets. So the challenge is huge, but it is going to take an all of government and all levels of government effort, as you said, because it's going to require, for example, stopping the precursors coming over from China. And as you know, the president has talked to his Chinese counterpart about that. Just whatever it was last month, there has been some progress on the Chinese side, just trying to slow down the precursor flow over here, and there are precursors that come from India and elsewhere as well. But stopping those precursors from coming in, we were down in CBP, talking to our CBP colleagues yesterday in Miami about the challenge of fentanyl, and it's a huge focus, but it's also got to be on the streets. So the drug task forces, the OCDEFs, and the local police departments need to really focus on it, and also it needs to be a public awareness program. That call I made to my daughter, everybody needs to make that call. No doubt,
one pill can kill. If you consider just the amount of just last year alone. The amount of fentanyl that has been seized, that's enough potentially to kill every American. Just that in itself. So clearly it's something we need to. You're right. There's no one easy fix, but technology clearly is a big part of this, and their ability to be able to transfer funds, transfer information. A comment was made about when I was doing a Senate testimony about border towns. Who's a border town, and one of the senators mentioned, I'm not on the border, so I'm not necessarily a border town. I got to tell you, if you got an internet connection, you're a border town, because that's where the majority of the stuff is coming. It's coming through social media platforms. I don't want to dive into it too real deep, but I strongly feel that social media platforms have a responsibility, a social responsibility, to be part of this solution, rather, because that's where the majority of this is coming in hands of Americans, a large percentage of it. Just your thoughts on social media's role. Those platforms, those companies that make tremendous amount of money from what they're doing, but lack of regulation and certainly their responsibility, social responsibility, knowing that we have a crisis on our hands. We've taken enough to kill every American off the street, yet we have not impacted at all the amount of deaths. It's continuing to climb. What role do you see social media platforms where they could be much more engaged in helping us with this national crisis?
Yeah, I mean, it's social media, just the internet generally, provides a marketplace that is just so much more complex and so much easier to use than the old days when I was prosecuting drug runners up in New York City, where you had, it was by courier, by, beeper and this kind of thing. And so yeah, I mean, more needs to be done to crack down on the actual trade of illegal drugs on the internet, and that's both the internet companies or the social media platforms as well as law enforcement. But extends also beyond just drugs. For example, the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee issued a report about January 6th, and talking about the intelligence failures by the FBI, by us, and others, and one of the things they made very clear is that they felt like the platforms needed to do more about the speech, the terrorism-related speech that is on this platform. So, and I know that great efforts are being made by some of those companies in certain areas, but this is a new world that we just haven't adjusted to, as a matter of regulation, as a matter of law, as a matter of practice, and as a matter of, frankly, just sort of expectations and duty on the part of those platforms.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate all the efforts you're doing. Just any final thoughts as we wrap this up, that you'd like to share with us?
I guess I'd just say, as I mentioned earlier, as the Secretary says, DHS is a Department of Partnerships, and we were down meeting with our partners down in Miami just yesterday, and meeting with Joe the other day. That's the best part of this job, but it's actually also the most indispensable, critical part of this job. So the federal, state, and local, territorial, tribal relationship between those authorities, it's multi-layered, it's complicated sometimes, but it's absolutely critical. Yeah. We all have to be on the same team if we're going to win.
No doubt. At least from my standpoint, is the largest rank and file police organization in the country. I can tell you that our working relationship with Department of Homeland Security has been great. Just there's not an issue or concern that we have not expressed, that we've not gotten some quick response from. So we appreciate that partnership as well. So again, thank you for all that you do and that partnership that we have in making America safe. And to our viewers back home and those that are listening to our podcast, thank you for tuning into the Blue View podcast, where we talk about the issues that are so vitally important to the men and women who suit up and show up every day and make a difference in our communities. Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. To get the latest from the National FOP, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at GLFOP and on Instagram at FOP National. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.